Clara's knees hit the frozen ground. Blood from her cracked lips dripped onto the snow, staining it pink. Her fingers, blue and numb, clutched the cast-iron skillet like a dying woman holding her last breath. Behind her, the town of Providence Crossing had already forgotten she existed. Ahead through the howling blizzard stood the iron gates of Hollister Ranch and the man they called Stone Hollister, who hadn't smiled in 8 years. She crawled forward, one hand, one knee, the skillet dragging beside her. If you want to see if Clara survives, subscribe to our channel and stay until the end. Comment below which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The snow had teeth. Clara felt them biting through the thin fabric of her dress, gnawing at her skin with every gust of wind that swept across the Wyoming prairie. Her boots had given out 2 miles back, the soles splitting clean off, like they'd decided they'd had enough of carrying her. Now her feet, wrapped in strips torn from her own petticoat, left bloody prints in the white. She didn't stop. Stopping meant dying. And Clara Jane Whitmore had decided 3 days ago, somewhere between losing everything she owned and watching the last stagecoach disappear without her, that she wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not until she'd proven to someone, anyone, that she was worth more than the nothing everyone said she was. The skillet in her hand weighed 12 pounds. She knew because she'd hefted it 1,000 times over 1,000 cook fires in her 28 years of living. Her mother's skillet. Black cast iron seasoned with decades of bacon grease and Sunday suppers and the quiet kind of love that never needed words. It was all she had left. That and the small deerskin pouch hanging around her neck, tucked beneath her dress, where it pressed against her heart like a secret. Her mother's spices: cumin, dried oregano, smoked chili powder, a single bay leaf wrapped in cloth, the recipe for survival. "Just a little further," she whispered to herself, the words freezing into crystals before they left her lips. "Just a little further, Clara. You can do this. Mama didn't raise no quitter." But Lord, she was tired. 3 days since Silas Crenshaw had taken everything. 3 days since she'd discovered that the man she was supposed to marry, the man who'd promised her a new life in the West, had been nothing but a snake in a gentleman's suit. He'd stolen her savings, her mother's jewelry, her trunk full of fabrics and threads, and the sewing patterns she'd spent years collecting. He'd left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's cooking things, which he'd dismissed as worthless frontier junk. Shows what he knew. The town of Providence Crossing had been no better. She'd stumbled in yesterday morning, half frozen, hoping for Christian charity. What she'd found instead was a boarding house madam named Mrs. Harlow, who'd taken one look at her ragged dress and bare fingers and sneered. "We don't take charity cases," the woman had said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This ain't a poorhouse. You want a roof, you pay. You can't pay, you leave." Clara had tried. God knows she'd tried. She'd offered to work cooking, cleaning, mending, anything, but Mrs. Harlow had laughed in her face. "Work? What work you think I need another mouth to feed? Look at you, skin and bones, probably got consumption or worse. Get out before you infect my paying guests." She'd been thrown out. Literally thrown. Mrs. Harlow's hired man, a thick-necked brute named Carl, had grabbed her by the arm and shoved her down the boarding house steps. She'd landed hard, her skillet clanging against the frozen boardwalk, and by the time she'd gathered herself enough to stand, the door had already slammed shut. The townspeople had watched. Not one had helped. Clara had seen them, the shopkeeper sweeping his porch, the banker's wife hurrying past with her eyes fixed straight ahead, the group of men smoking outside the saloon. They'd all seen a woman thrown into the street like garbage, and they'd all decided it wasn't their concern. That was yesterday. Today, she was walking. Old Mattie, the ancient Crow woman who lived in a shack at the edge of town, had found her huddled behind the livery stable last night, trying to stay warm next to the horses. Clara had been too frozen to be scared when the old woman appeared out of the darkness like a ghost. "You gonna die out here, girl," Mattie had said, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "Die cold and alone, and the wolves gonna scatter your bones come spring." "Then let them," Clara had answered, too tired to care. "Ain't nobody gonna miss me anyway." Maddie had laughed at that, a dry rattling sound. Self-pity. That's the real killer out here. Freezes the spirit long before the cold takes the body. She'd given Clara a blanket, a piece of dried meat, and a direction. "There's a ranch, north of here. Big place belongs to a man named Hollister. They call him Stone. Say he ain't smiled since his wife died. Say he's the coldest man in Wyoming." "And you think he's gonna help me?" Clara had asked, bitter. A cold man helping a stranger. Maddie had smiled then, showing gaps where teeth used to be. "Cold ain't the same as cruel, girl. Cold is just waiting for something warm enough to melt it." She'd pressed something into Clara's palm, a small bundle of dried herbs. "Wild sage, from the old hills. You put this in your cooking, it'll make a man remember what home feels like. Even a man who forgot he ever had one." Clara had tried to thank her, but Maddie was already shuffling away into the darkness. "Walk north," the old woman called back. "Don't stop walking, and when you get to them, iron gates, don't you dare beg. You hear me? You tell him what you can do. A woman who knows her worth don't need to beg." So Clara walked, through the night, through the blizzard that rolled in at dawn, through the wind that tried to knock her flat, and the snow that tried to bury her alive. She walked because stopping wasn't an option. And now, as the weak afternoon light began to fade behind the thick gray clouds, she saw it. The fence. It appeared out of the white, like a dark line drawn across the world. 3 strands of taut wire strung between solid wooden posts, stretching as far as she could see in either direction. Beyond it, barely visible through the swirling snow, she could make out shapes. Buildings. The dark bulk of a barn. The angular silhouette of a house. Hollister Ranch. Clara's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the nearest fence post to steady herself, the frozen wood burning her bare palm, and she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I made it," she breathed. "Lord have mercy, I made it." But making it to the fence wasn't the same as making it inside. She followed the fence line for what felt like hours, her body moving on pure stubbornness now, until she found it, the gate. Tall iron gates set into a stone archway, the metalwork twisted into shapes that might have been beautiful if she'd had the strength to look up. Above them, burned into a wooden beam, were 2 words, Hollister Ranch. The gates were closed. Clara stood before them, swaying on her feet. The blizzard howled around her, pulling at her dress, throwing ice into her face. She was so cold she'd stopped shivering, which some distant part of her mind recognized as a very bad sign. She raised her hand, made a fist, and knocked on the iron gate. The sound was pathetic, a weak thump swallowed instantly by the wind. She tried again harder, and this time managed something closer to an actual knock. Nothing. Of course nothing. Who would hear her in this storm? Who would be watching the gates when the whole world was white? Clara felt her legs buckle. She grabbed the gate to keep from falling, her fingers threading through the iron bars, and she hung there for a moment, suspended between standing and collapsing. "This is how I die," she thought. Frozen to a rich man's gate like some kind of pitiful decoration. The thought made her angry. It was a small anger, barely a spark in the overwhelming cold, but it was enough to make her open her mouth and scream. "Hello! Is anyone there? Please! I need help!" The wind tore her words away. She screamed again, louder, her voice cracking. "Please, I'll die out here! Someone help me!" Nothing. Clara's grip on the gate was slipping. Her fingers were too numb to hold on. She felt herself sliding down the iron bars, scraping against her palms, and then she was on her knees in the snow, and then she was falling forward, and the white was everywhere. And, "What in God's name?" The voice cut through the howl of the wind like a knife. Clara tried to lift her head, tried to see who was speaking, but her body wouldn't cooperate. All she could make out was dark shapes against the white, a figure on horseback, coming fast through the gate that was somehow now open. "Get the boss," the voice shouted. "We got a woman collapsed at the gates." More voices, more shapes, hands grabbing her, lifting her. The world tilted and spun. Is she dead? She's breathing, barely. What's she doing out in this storm? How the hell should I know? Help me get her inside. Clara tried to speak, tried to say she could walk, she didn't need carrying, she wasn't helpless, but her mouth wouldn't form the words. All that came out was a weak moan. "She's got a skillet." "A what?" "A cast iron skillet. She's holding it. Won't let go." "Just leave it. Bring her to the cookhouse, it's closest." "What about the boss?" "I'll fetch him. You get her warm before she freezes solid." Movement. Cold air replaced by warm. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and something meaty cooking. Clara felt herself being lowered onto something hard, a bench maybe, and then blessed beautiful heat was seeping into her frozen limbs. She still couldn't open her eyes, but she could hear. Footsteps, urgent voices, the clatter of someone stoking a fire, the scrape of a chair being pulled across a wooden floor. Get them rags off her feet. Lord Almighty, she walked here barefoot. Here, wrap her in this blanket. She needs hot water, not too hot or it'll shock her system. Who is she? Does it matter? She's dying. The voices swirled around Clara like the wind outside, but one sound cut through all of them. Heavy footsteps approaching. Deliberate, unhurried. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who expected the world to wait for him. The room went quiet. What's going on here? The voice was low and flat with no warmth in it at all. It reminded Clara of stone, not cold exactly, but utterly solid. Immovable. Found her at the gates, boss. Collapsed in the snow. Looks like she walked here through the storm. A long pause. She alive. For now. Won't be for long if she don't warm up proper. Another pause. Clara could feel someone looking at her. The weight of that gaze was almost physical, pressing down on her like a hand. Who is she? Don't know, Mr. Hollister. She ain't said nothing. Can't hardly breathe, let alone talk. Footsteps. Closer now. Clara felt the air shift as someone crouched beside her. She's holding a skillet. Yes, sir. We tried to take it, but she won't let go. Even half dead, she's got a grip like iron. Another silence. Long enough that Clara started to wonder if the man had left. Then his voice again, quieter this time. Her feet are bleeding. Yes, sir. Walked here through the snow with nothing but rags wrapped around them. Must have come from town, maybe further. In this storm. Yes, sir. Clara felt something touch her face. A hand. Large and calloused, and surprisingly gentle, brushing the ice from her cheek. Open your eyes. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And somehow, despite everything, despite the cold that had seeped into her bones, and the exhaustion that pressed down on her like a physical weight, Clara obeyed. The world came into focus slowly. First the ceiling, rough wooden beams, dark with age and smoke, then the walls cluttered with pots and pans and kitchen implements. And finally, the man crouched beside her. Nathaniel Hollister was not what she expected. He was tall. She could tell that even with him crouching with broad shoulders that strained against a simple dark shirt. His hair was black, threaded with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered in that particular way of men who'd spent their lives under the open sky. Strong jaw, deep-set eyes, lines around his mouth that suggested he'd once known how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her. They were gray, not the soft gray of morning clouds, but the hard gray of winter steel. Cold eyes, empty eyes. The eyes of a man who'd looked at something terrible once and never quite looked away. Stone Hollister. She understood the name now. Can you speak? He asked. Clara's throat felt like she'd swallowed sand. She tried to lick her lips, tasted blood from the cracks. Yes. The word came out as a rasp. Good. His face showed nothing, no sympathy, no curiosity, no warmth. Who are you? C. Clara Whitmore. Where did you come from? Town, Providence Crossing. His eyebrow twitched, the only sign of reaction. That's 12 miles. You walked 12 miles in this storm. Yes. Why? Clara could feel the other men watching, feel the weight of their judgment on her ragged clothes and bleeding feet, and the desperation she knew was written all over her face. Don't beg, Maddie had said. Tell him what you can do. She forced herself to meet his cold gray eyes. They threw me out. The boarding house. Said I couldn't pay, so I had to leave. No one would help. So I walked. And you came here to my ranch. The old Crow woman, Maddie. She said you might have work. Something flickered in those stone-gray eyes. Maddie sent you. She said cold ain't the same as cruel. The flicker became something else. Something Clara couldn't read. Hollister studied her for a long moment, his face utterly unreadable. What can you do? Here it was. The moment that would decide everything. Clara thought of her mother. Thought of all those mornings, standing over a hot stove, learning the secrets of cumin and oregano, and how to make a meal from almost nothing. Thought of the skillet still clutched in her frozen hand. I know I don't look like much, sir, she said, and her voice was stronger now, steadier. The warmth of the cookhouse was seeping into her bones, thawing something more than just her flesh. I know I got nothing to offer but myself. I ain't pretty. I ain't educated. I got no family, no money, no references. She paused, drew a breath. But I can cook. The words hung in the air between them. I can take a handful of beans and make them taste like a feast. I can turn tough meat into something tender. I can make a kitchen feel like home even when everything outside is cold and cruel and hard. She met his eyes directly, this cold, hard man who everyone said never smiled. I ain't asking for charity, Mr. Hollister. I'm asking for a chance. Let me cook for you. One meal. If it ain't the best thing you've eaten in years, you can throw me back out in the snow yourself. Silence. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. The men standing around them seemed to have stopped breathing. Nathaniel Hollister looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to the skillet still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. That's a good pan, he said. Clara blinked. Sir, cast iron, well seasoned. You can tell a lot about a cook from their pan. He straightened up his knees, cracking as he rose to his full height. He towered over her, a dark silhouette against the firelight. A woman who walks 12 miles through a blizzard, holding on to a skillet instead of dropping it to save herself. That's either crazy or dedicated. He turned to the men standing nearby. Leo, show her where the pantry is. She says she can cook. Let's see if she's telling the truth. His gray eyes found hers one more time. The men eat when the sun touches that western ridge. That's 2 hours from now. There'll be 15 of them. Clara felt her heart skip. Sir, you wanted a chance. This is it. His voice held no warmth, no encouragement, no kindness. Don't waste it. And he walked out. The door closed behind him, letting in a brief howl of wind and snow before cutting it off. Clara lay there on the bench, feeling returning painfully to her fingers and toes, and stared at the ceiling. 2 hours. 15 men. And she could barely feel her hands. She started to laugh. It was a thin, slightly hysterical sound, but she couldn't help it. She'd been thrown out frozen, nearly died, dragged herself across miles of snow-covered prairie, and now she had 2 hours to prove she deserved to live. God had a sense of humor after all. Ma'am? The young ranch hand Leo Hollister had called him was looking at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. You okay? You need a doctor or something. Clara pushed herself upright. Her whole body screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She'd been ignoring her body's complaints for 3 days now. What was 2 more hours? "I don't need a doctor," she said, swinging her legs off the bench. Her feet were agony, but they held her weight. "I need to see your pantry." "Ma'am, you can barely stand." "I can stand just fine." She looked at him, really looked, and saw a young man, maybe 22, with the weathered face of someone who'd grown up hard but hadn't let it make him mean. "What's your name?" "Leo, ma'am. Leo Carpenter." "Well, Leo Carpenter, I just walked 12 miles through a blizzard to get here. I ain't about to let a little thing like frostbitten feet stop me from keeping my word." She held out her hand. "Help me up proper and show me where you keep the food. I got work to do." Leo stared at her for a moment. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and took her hand. The pantry was a tomb of salt and necessity. Clara stood in the doorway, her damaged feet throbbing beneath her, and took inventory with eyes that had been doing this since she was 6 years old, standing on a stool beside her mother. Sacks of flour, dried beans, a barrel of salt pork, potatoes gone soft in their crate, onions, coffee, lard, nothing fresh, nothing green, nothing that spoke of anything but survival. Perfect. "This is it?" she asked Leo. "Yes, ma'am. We ain't had a proper cook in 4 months. Just been making do." "Who's been feeding the men?" Leo rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "We take turns. Mostly it's just beans and salt pork. Sometimes biscuits if someone remembers how." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "Get me water," she said. "As much as you can carry, and stoke that fire until I can feel the heat from across the room." "Yes, ma'am." He hurried off, and Clara allowed herself one moment, just one, to lean against the pantry doorframe and close her eyes. Her whole body was a symphony of pain. Her feet screamed with every step. Her fingers were still stiff and clumsy from the cold. Her head pounded, and her stomach was so empty it had stopped growling hours ago. But she'd been hungry before. She'd been tired before. She'd cooked through worse. "You can do this, Clara Jane. Mama didn't raise no quitter." She opened her eyes and got to work. The first thing she did was build up the fire in the great iron stove until it roared like a living thing. Heat was the foundation. Heat was life. The cookhouse, which had felt merely warm when they'd carried her in, soon became almost hot, pushing back against the frozen world outside. Then the salt pork. She cut thick slabs of it and set them in her mother's skillet, her skillet now to render. The fat would be the foundation of everything. As it began to sizzle and pop, the first real smell of cooking filled the room. It was a simple smell: pork fat and smoke. But Clara watched the men who'd gathered near the cookhouse door, pretending they were just getting warm, pretending they weren't watching her, and she saw their heads turn, saw their nostrils flare. They were hungry, not just in their bellies, but somewhere deeper. She knew that hunger. She'd felt it herself walking through the storm. It was the hunger for something that felt like care, something that felt like home. Leo returned with 2 buckets of water. "What else you need, ma'am?" "Onions, lots of them, and potatoes, and—" She hesitated, her hand going to the deerskin pouch at her chest. "That's all for now." She peeled onions until her eyes streamed tears. But these were good tears, honest tears, the kind that came from work instead of sorrow. She diced them fine and added them to the rendered pork fat, and the smell that rose up was rich and sweet and impossibly good. The men at the door had stopped pretending. They were openly watching now, their faces caught between suspicion and hope. "Never seen nobody cry that much over onions," one of them said. Old man, grizzled, face like leather left out in the sun. "Good onions are worth crying over," Clara said without looking up. "What's your name?" "Jebediah. Jeb." He stepped closer, drawn by the smell despite himself. "You really think you can feed 15 men with salt pork and onions?" "I ain't done yet." She added the potatoes cut into chunks, added water from the buckets, added salt. Not too much, you could always add more, but you couldn't take it away. Her mother's voice in her head, and then she reached for her pouch. The deerskin was warm from being pressed against her heart. She opened it and breathed in the scent of her mother's legacy: cumin, chili, oregano, the single bay leaf, and the wild sage Maddie had given her. She added them to the pot with hands that trembled slightly. Not from cold this time, but from something else. Something sacred. "What's that?" Leo asked, leaning in. "Smells different." Family recipe. She stirred the pot slowly, watching the spices bloom in the hot liquid, watching the color deepen from pale to rich amber. The smell was changing now, becoming something complex and layered and warm. It was the smell of her mother's kitchen in Boston, the smell of Sunday suppers and cold winter nights and love that never needed words. It was the smell of everything she'd lost. And now it was filling this cold, lonely cookhouse in the middle of Wyoming, pushing back against the storm outside like a prayer. "Lord have mercy," Jebediah breathed. "What is that?" Clara didn't answer. She just kept stirring. The stew needed time. That was the secret her mother had taught her. You couldn't rush good food any more than you could rush good love. So while it simmered, she turned her attention to biscuits. Her hands remembered the motions even when her mind was foggy with exhaustion. Flour, lard, salt, water. Mix until just combined. Never overwork the dough or you'll make it tough. Her mother's voice again, patient and kind. She shaped them into rough rounds and set them in a baking pan. The oven was hot enough now. She slid them in and turned back to her stew. "You need to sit down." The voice came from behind her. Clara turned to find a man she hadn't noticed before standing in the shadows near the back door. He was lean and quiet, with dark hair and gentle brown eyes, and he moved with a kind of careful grace that reminded her of a deer. "I'm fine," she said. "You're swaying on your feet." "I said I'm fine." The man didn't argue. He just pulled a wooden crate over to the stove and set it down beside her. "For when you change your mind," he said. Then he walked to the prep table, picked up a knife, and started peeling potatoes. Clara stared at him. "What are you doing?" He didn't look up, just kept peeling, his movements slow but precise. "You ain't gonna make it 2 hours standing the whole time," he said. "And these potatoes need peeling anyway." "I didn't ask for help." "Didn't say you did." He still hadn't looked at her, hadn't made a fuss. He was just helping, quietly, without expectation. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. Just a small fracture, but enough to let something warm leak through. "What's your name?" she asked. "Zeke." "Thank you, Zeke." He nodded, kept peeling. She did sit down eventually. Just for a minute, she told herself. Just to rest her feet. But the minute stretched into 5 and then 10, and by the time she stood up again to check the stew, she realized the pain had dulled to something almost manageable. Zeke had finished the potatoes and moved on to chopping more onions. He worked in complete silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of two people who didn't need words to understand each other. "You don't talk much," Clara said. Zeke looked up at her then, and something in his expression shifted. He touched his throat and shook his head. "Oh. You can't speak?" He shook his head again. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean..." He held up a hand, stopping her apology. Then he smiled, a small, gentle smile that transformed his whole face, and went back to chopping. Clara watched him for a moment, this quiet man who'd shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than the entire town of Providence Crossing had shown her in a day. Then she turned back to her stew and stirred it with renewed determination. The biscuits came out golden brown, their tops perfectly domed, their bottoms just slightly crisp. Clara broke one open and watched the steam rise, smelled the buttery, yeasty scent of fresh bread. Her mother would have been proud. "Lord Almighty," Jebediah again, his weathered face slack with something like awe. He was staring at the biscuits like they were made of gold. "You can have one," Clara said. "Just one. The rest are for supper." He reached out with a trembling hand and took a biscuit, bit into it, closed his eyes. "Woman," he said, his voice rough, "I ain't had a biscuit this good since my mama died." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Stupid tears. She blinked them away. "Go on now," she said. "Tell the others supper's almost ready." Jebediah left, still clutching his half-eaten biscuit like a treasure. Through the open door, Clara heard his voice raised in what could only be described as evangelical fervor. "Boys, you ain't gonna believe this. We got ourselves a real cook." More men drifted toward the cookhouse. 5, 10, 15, just like Hollister had said. They filed in and sat at the long wooden tables, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion, and barely suppressed hope. Clara served them herself, limping between the stove and the tables, ladling generous portions of stew onto tin plates and setting biscuits beside them. Her feet were agony. Her arms shook with exhaustion. But she kept moving. When every man had a plate, she stepped back and watched. The silence that fell was absolute. Not the silence of disappointment or disgust. This was different. This was the silence of men who'd forgotten what good food tasted like suddenly remembering. This was the silence of recognition. One by one, they lowered their heads over their plates and began to eat. Really eat with the focused intensity of people who weren't just filling their bellies, but feeding their souls. No one spoke. No one complained. They just ate. Clara watched from her place by the stove, her hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking. This was it. This was the verdict. Everything she'd survived, the betrayal, the abandonment, the frozen miles of prairie, it all came down to this moment. Please, she thought. Please let it be enough. The door opened. Cold air rushed in along with a swirl of snow and the unmistakable presence of Nathaniel Hollister. The men straightened in their seats. The room, which had been filled with the quiet sounds of eating, went utterly still. Even the fire in the stove seemed to dim. Hollister walked to the pot and looked inside. His face showed nothing. Not approval, not disapproval, not anything Clara could read. He picked up a clean plate from the stack beside the stove and served himself a portion of stew. Added 2 biscuits. Then he sat at the head of the main table in a chair the other men had left empty and began to eat. Clara stopped breathing. He ate slowly, deliberately. Each bite was measured, considered, as if he were weighing the food not just for taste, but for something deeper. His face remained a mask of stone. He finished the stew, ate both biscuits, wiped his mouth with a cloth. Then he looked at her, those gray eyes cold as the storm outside. But there was something in them now, something that hadn't been there before. "Who taught you to cook?" Clara's throat was dry. "My mother, sir. She cooked like this." "Yes, sir, better." Something flickered in his expression, almost a smile, but not quite. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She felt tears threatening again and forced them down with sheer will. "She was, sir." Hollister nodded once, a single deliberate dip of his chin. "Leo." The young ranch hand jumped to attention. "Yes, sir. Clear out the storage room behind the pantry. Put in a cot and a lamp." His eyes never left Clara's face. "Miss Whitmore will be staying." Clara's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the edge of the stove to steady herself, not caring that the metal burned her palm. "Sir." Hollister stood his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Breakfast is at sunrise. The men work hard, they eat a lot." He paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "Don't disappoint me." And then he was gone, swallowed by the storm outside. The room erupted. The men were talking all at once, congratulating her, praising the food, asking questions she couldn't quite follow through the fog of exhaustion and relief that suddenly descended on her. Ma'am. You okay?" It was Leo. His young face creased with concern. Clara realized she was still gripping the stove, her knuckles white, her whole body shaking. "I'm fine," she said, or tried to say. The words came out slurred, barely audible. "You need to rest. Come on, I'll show you. The dishes. I have to. We'll do the dishes." This from Jebediah, who had risen from his seat and was already gathering plates. "You cooked. We clean. That's how it works now." Clara wanted to argue. She wasn't used to people helping her, taking care of her. But her body had finally reached its limit. 3 days of walking, freezing, starving, and then 2 hours of cooking on feet that felt like raw meat. It all came crashing down at once. Zeke appeared at her side. He didn't say anything, couldn't say anything, but he offered his arm steady and strong. Clara took it. He helped her to the small storage room Leo had cleared out. It was barely bigger than a closet, smelling of dust and dried herbs, but there was a narrow cot with a blanket on it, and a small oil lamp on a crate beside it. It was the most beautiful room she'd ever seen. "Thank you," she whispered. Zeke nodded. His dark eyes were warm with something that might have been understanding. He pointed to the lamp, then to her, then made a motion like closing his eyes. "Sleep." "I will," she promised. He left, pulling the door softly closed behind him. Clara stood alone in the tiny room, the sounds of men cleaning dishes drifting through the thin walls. She looked at the cot, at the blanket, at the lamp that cast a small warm circle of light. She had a place. She had a chance. Tomorrow she would have to prove herself again. And the day after that. And the day after that. One meal at a time, one day at a time, until she'd earned her place here for good. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in 3 days, she knew where she would sleep. She knew she would be warm. She knew she would be safe. Clara sank down onto the cot, still clutching her mother's skillet. The cast iron was warm from cooking, and she held it against her chest like a child holding a stuffed toy. "I made it, Mama," she whispered into the darkness. "I made it." And then finally, she let herself cry. Not the quiet tears of earlier, but great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for her mother, dead 2 years now. She cried for the life she'd lost to Silas Crenshaw's lies. She cried for the townspeople who'd watched her thrown into the street and done nothing. But mostly she cried from relief. The storm still raged outside. The future was still uncertain. She was still a stranger in a strange place, surrounded by men she didn't know, dependent on the mercy of a man they called Stone. But she had survived. She had cooked. And tomorrow, she would do it all again. Clara curled around her mother's skillet, pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin, and let the exhaustion finally claim her. Her last thought before sleep dragged her under was of Hollister's gray eyes and the almost smile that had flickered across his face. Cold ain't the same as cruel, Maddie had said. Maybe the old woman was right. The days folded into weeks, and Clara learned the rhythm of Hollister Ranch, like a new language. She rose before the sun when the world outside was still black and bitter cold. She stoked the fire in the great iron stove until it roared with life. She put coffee on to boil strong enough to wake the dead the way the men liked it, and started breakfast. Bacon, eggs when they had them. Biscuits every morning without fail. Oatmeal thick with molasses on the coldest days. Pancakes on Sundays because even hard men needed something to look forward to. The men came to trust her. It happened slowly, the way snow melts in spring, 1 degree at a time, barely visible until suddenly the ground is bare. First, it was Jebediah who started calling her Miss Clara instead of the new cook. Then Leo, who began lingering after meals to help her wash dishes, chattering about his family back in Missouri and the girl he hoped to marry someday. Then the others, men whose names she learned one by one, whose preferences she memorized without being asked. Charlie liked his coffee black. Old Pete couldn't eat onions on account of his stomach. Thomas had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, so she started leaving an extra biscuit at his place, drizzled with honey. Small things, quiet things. the language of care that needed no words. But Zeke was different. He appeared every morning before sunrise, slipping into the cookhouse like a shadow. He never asked what she needed, he just saw. If she was chopping vegetables, he would pick up a knife and start peeling. If she was kneading dough, he would already be greasing the pans. If she was tired, and she was always tired, though she tried not to show it, he would pull the wooden crate beside the stove and give her a look that said, "Sit down," without speaking a word. They worked in silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of understanding. One morning, 3 weeks after her arrival, Clara found a small bundle on the cookhouse step. She unwrapped it to discover a handful of dried herbs, wild thyme by the smell, and a piece of bark she didn't recognize. She looked up to find Zeke watching from across the yard. He raised one hand in acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the stables. Clara held the herbs to her nose and breathed deep. It smelled like the hills beyond the ranch, wild and free and alive. That night she added the thyme to her stew. The men noticed the difference immediately. "What did you do different?" Charlie asked, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. "Secret ingredient," Clara said. Charlie narrowed his eyes. "You ain't gonna tell us." "If I told you, it wouldn't be a secret." The men laughed, actually laughed, and Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. For the first time since her mother died, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The gifts kept coming. Wild onions one morning, mushrooms another, a pouch of pine nuts that must have taken hours to gather and crack. Each offering appeared on her doorstep before dawn, and each time she looked up to find Zeke watching from a distance. She never thanked him with words. She thanked him with food, making sure he got the choicest cuts of meat, the freshest biscuits, the extra ladle of gravy. It was their own private language, and it needed no translation. But not everyone welcomed her presence. The black carriage arrived on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the frozen mud of the ranch yard like a knife through butter. Clara watched from the cookhouse window as the driver, a thin, sour-faced man in a heavy coat, climbed down and opened the passenger door. The woman who emerged was dressed entirely in black. She was old, 65, maybe 70, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun and a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood. She carried a dark cane with a silver handle, and she moved with the stiff-legged gait of someone whose joints had turned to rust. But it was her eyes that made Clara's blood run cold. They were dark, small, sharp as flint, and they swept across the ranch yard with the possessive intensity of a hawk surveying its territory. "Who's that?" Clara asked Leo, who had come in for his morning coffee. Leo's face went pale. "That's Miss Augusta, Mr. Hollister's aunt." "His aunt. She raised him after his folks died. Comes to visit every few months." He lowered his voice. "She don't like strangers much, especially women." Clara's hands stilled on the bread dough. "What do you mean?" "After Mrs. Hollister passed, the boss's wife, Miss Augusta, tried to find him a new one. Brought women from back east, from California, from everywhere. None of them lasted more than a month." He shook his head. "She'd drive them off. Don't know how, but she always did." Clara felt the warmth drain from the room. "How many?" "6, maybe 7. I lost count." The cookhouse door opened. Clara knew, even before she turned around, who she would find. The air itself seemed to curdle. Augusta Hollister stood in the doorway, her black dress absorbing the light like a void. Her cane tapped once against the floor, a deliberate, commanding sound. "So," she said, and her voice was like dry leaves scraping against stone. "This is the drifter my nephew has seen fit to install in my kitchen." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face the woman. "Ma'am." "I didn't ask you to speak." The words landed like a slap. Clara felt her cheeks flush, but she held her ground. Augusta moved into the room, her dark eyes taking in everything. The clean surfaces, the organized pantry, the bread rising under a cloth. Her face showed no approval, only a cold proprietary resentment. "You've been here 3 weeks," Augusta said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. And you think that entitles you to something? Clara's hands tightened into fists beneath her apron. I think it entitles me to nothing, ma'am. Everything I have here I've earned. Augusta's thin lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Earned? How charming. She took another step closer, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. Let me tell you something, girl. I've seen your kind before. Pretty enough face sad story knows how to cook a decent meal. You think that's special? You think that makes you different from the others? I don't know about the others, ma'am. I only know about me. Then let me educate you. Augusta's voice dropped to a hiss. This ranch, this kitchen, they belong to the Hollister family. They have belonged to us for 3 generations. My brother built this place from nothing. My nephew made it prosper. And I will not stand by and watch some homeless drifter worm her way into what isn't hers. Clara felt anger rising in her chest, hot and bright. I ain't trying to worm my way into anything. I'm just trying to cook. Is that what you tell yourself? Augusta leaned closer, and Clara could smell her perfume, something old and faded and sad. Is that the story you've constructed, the innocent little cook just trying to survive? Don't insult my intelligence. She straightened up, her dark eyes glittering with malice. I know what you're after. I've seen it 6 times before. You think if you stay long enough, if you make yourself useful enough, my nephew will look at you the way he used to look at his wife. You think you can take her place. Don't interrupt me. The cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. Elizabeth was a saint. She was kind and beautiful and good, and she gave Nathaniel a daughter, and when the fever took them both, it took the best part of him with them. What's left is mine to protect, and I will protect it from opportunists like you with my dying breath. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She wanted to shout. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to tell this bitter old woman that she hadn't asked for any of this, that all she'd wanted was a chance to survive, not to steal anyone's place or anyone's heart. But the words wouldn't come. Augusta seemed to take her silence as surrender. She smiled a cold, triumphant thing and turned toward the door. Enjoy your time here, Miss Whitmore. It won't last long. The door slammed behind her. Clara stood alone in the cookhouse, trembling. The bread dough lay forgotten on the table. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch horses, nickering men shouting the eternal wind. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run. She wanted to pack her skillet and her spice pouch and walk back out into the snow and never look back. But she didn't. She picked up the bread dough. She started kneading. And with each push and fold and turn, she made herself a promise. I ain't leaving. Not for you. Not for anyone. That night, she cooked the best meal she'd ever made. It wasn't spite exactly. It was something purer than that. It was the determination to prove to Augusta, to the men, to herself, that she belonged here. That her place at this ranch wasn't built on deception or ambition, but on something real. Something that couldn't be taken away. She made roast beef slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. She made mashed potatoes, whipped with butter and cream. She made gravy thick with pan drippings and herbs. She made apple pie for dessert, the first pie she'd attempted since arriving, with a crust so flaky it shattered at the first bite. The men ate in stunned silence. Even Augusta, who had taken her place at the head of the table beside Nathaniel, couldn't hide her reaction. Clara watched her take a bite of the pie, watched something flicker across that hard, bitter face. Surprise maybe, or grudging acknowledgement. But it was Nathaniel's reaction that mattered. He ate slowly, as he always did, deliberately. But when he finished his slice of pie, he looked up and caught Clara's eye across the room. This is good, he said. 2 words. Flat and simple. But from a man who barely spoke at all, they meant everything. Augusta's face went tight. It's adequate. It's good, Nathaniel repeated, and there was something in his voice, a quiet firmness that silenced any further argument. Clara ducked her head to hide her smile. The battle lines had been drawn. The weeks that followed were a war of attrition. Augusta did not attack directly again. She was too clever for that. Instead, she waged a campaign of subtle cruelties, a pointed comment here, a dismissive glance there, questions about Clara's past, designed to humiliate and expose. "Where did you say you came from, Miss Whitmore?" "Boston, ma'am." "And what brought you all the way out here?" "I was supposed to be married." "Supposed to be? How interesting. What happened to the fortunate groom?" Clara's hands tightened on the dish she was washing. "He turned out to be a liar and a thief. He took everything I had and left me with nothing." Augusta's eyes glittered with something like satisfaction. "How careless of you, to be so easily deceived." "Yes, ma'am, I reckon it was." She refused to rise to the bait, refused to show weakness. Every cruel comment she absorbed, every pointed question she answered with quiet dignity. She would not give Augusta the satisfaction of breaking her, but it was hard. Lord, it was hard. The hardest part was watching Augusta with Nathaniel. She hovered around him like a shadow, controlling his schedule, managing his correspondence, inserting herself into every aspect of his life. And Nathaniel let her. He seemed almost passive in her presence, as if the stone-cold rancher became someone smaller, someone diminished whenever his aunt was near. Clara didn't understand it. This was a man who commanded 40 ranch hands with a look. A man whose word was law across 1,000 acres of Wyoming territory. How could he let one bitter old woman control him so completely? The answer came on a night when the wind was howling and the snow was falling thick enough to bury a man standing still. Clara was cleaning up after dinner when she heard voices from the main house, raised voices, which was unusual. She moved to the cookhouse window and peered out. The door to the main house was open, light spilling out into the darkness. She could see 2 figures silhouetted against the glow, Augusta and Nathaniel, and though she couldn't make out the words, she could hear the tone. Augusta's voice was sharp, accusing. Nathaniel's was low, defensive. Then Augusta said something, a single sentence that carried clearly through the cold night air. "You killed them, Nathaniel. You killed my Elizabeth and my great-niece. And if you think I'll let another woman take her place, you're as mad as you are guilty." Silence. Clara watched Nathaniel's silhouette sag, as if someone had cut the strings that held him upright. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just stood there absorbing the blow. Then the door closed and the light disappeared. Clara stood in the darkness of the cookhouse, her heart breaking for a man she barely knew. He blames himself. He's been carrying that guilt for 8 years, and she uses it to control him. The realization changed everything. Augusta wasn't just a bitter old woman protecting her territory. She was a jailer keeping Nathaniel locked in a prison of guilt and grief. And as long as he believed he deserved to be punished, he would never break free. Clara thought about what Maddie had said. Cold ain't the same as cruel. Cold is just waiting. Waiting for something warm enough to melt it. Maybe that was her purpose here. Not just to cook. Not just to survive. But to offer something warm to a man who'd been frozen for 8 years. It was a dangerous thought, the kind of thought that could get her heart broken. But Clara had never been good at playing it safe. The next morning she made Nathaniel's favorite breakfast biscuits and gravy with extra sausage and served him personally instead of letting him serve himself. He looked up at her surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She met his gray eyes and held them. "I wanted to." Something shifted in his expression. Just for a moment, the stone cracked, and she caught a glimpse of the man underneath, tired, lonely, desperately wanting to feel something other than guilt. Then the wall came back up. "Thank you," he said, and looked away. But Clara had seen what she needed to see. There was still something alive in there. Something worth fighting for. She was washing dishes that afternoon when the door crashed open. Clara spun around her hand, going instinctively to the knife on the counter. But it wasn't Augusta. It wasn't one of the ranch hands. It was a man she'd hoped never to see again. Silas Crenshaw stood in the doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of his expensive coat, a smile on his handsome face that made her blood run cold. "Clara," he said, spreading his arms wide. "My darling Clara, I've been looking everywhere for you." She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stepped into the cookhouse, bringing the cold with him. "Don't look so surprised, sweetheart. Did you really think you could run from me forever? Get out." The words came out as a whisper. Silas laughed. "Get out. After I've come all this way to find you." He looked around the cookhouse with theatrical interest. "So this is where you've been hiding. Cooking for cowboys. How quaint. How pathetic." Clara found her voice. "I ain't hiding from nobody, and I ain't your sweetheart. Now get out before I scream." "Scream?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "And tell them what? That your fiancé has come to claim his bride." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I still have the betrothal agreement you signed, Clara. Legally binding. You belong to me. That agreement was based on lies. You stole from me. I did what was necessary to secure our future together." He took another step closer. "Now I'm willing to forgive your little adventure. We'll go back east, start fresh. No one needs to know about your time playing house with a bunch of dirty ranchers." Clara grabbed the knife from the counter. "I said get out." Silas's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Put that down, Clara. You're embarrassing yourself." "I'll cut you if I have to." "No, you won't." He moved faster than she expected, grabbing her wrist and squeezing until she cried out and the knife clattered to the floor. "You never did have the spine for violence. That's what I liked about you, so soft, so trusting, so easy to—" "Let her go." The voice came from the doorway, low, flat, deadly. Silas turned his grip still tight on Clara's wrist. Nathaniel Hollister stood there, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something other than cold emptiness in his eyes. There was fire. "This is a private matter," Silas said smoothly. "Between me and my fiancée." "She ain't your fiancée. She's my cook." Nathaniel stepped into the room, and despite having no weapon, his presence filled the space like a physical force. "And you're trespassing on my land. I have legal documents. I don't care if you have a letter from God Almighty. You put your hands on a woman in my house. That ends one of two ways: you walk out, or you get carried out." Silas hesitated. Clara could see him calculating the odds, the risks, the potential rewards. He was a coward at heart. She'd known that even when she'd believed she loved him. He released her wrist. "This isn't over," he said, straightening his coat. "I have connections in this territory, powerful connections. You'll be hearing from me, Hollister. I'll be waiting." Silas shot Clara one last look, a promise of future pain, and then he was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow. Clara's legs gave out. She would have hit the floor if Nathaniel hadn't caught her. His arms were strong and steady, and she found herself pressed against his chest, her whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know he'd find me. I never thought—" "Hush." The word was quiet, but firm. "Ain't nothing to apologize for. He's going to cause trouble. He said he has connections. Let him try." Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. "Nobody comes onto my land and threatens my people. Nobody." "My people." Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. His gray eyes were still hard, still cold. But beneath the ice, she could see something else. Something that looked almost like protective fury. Something that looked almost like caring. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words cost him something. "Because you're the first person in 8 years who made this place feel like something other than a tomb." Then he released her and stepped back, the wall coming up again, the stone settling back into place. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll have Leo watch the roads." And he was gone. Clara stood alone in the cookhouse, trembling. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled in the stove. And somewhere out there in the storm, Silas Crenshaw was already planning his next move. But for the first time since he'd destroyed her life, Clara wasn't afraid. She had something now that she hadn't had before. She had people willing to fight for her. Silas kept his promise. 3 days after his visit to the cookhouse, a letter arrived at the ranch. Clara watched from the window as the writer delivered it to Nathaniel on the front porch. She watched Nathaniel's face as he read it, watched the stone mask harden into something even colder. He didn't tell her what the letter said. But that evening he called a meeting in the main house. All the senior hands. Leo, Jebediah, the foreman, a grizzled man named Tom Barker. Even Zeke, who stood silent in the corner with his arms crossed. Clara wasn't invited, but she heard about it from Leo afterward. Crenshaw's filed a claim with the territorial court. Leo set his young face tight with anger. Says you stole property from him. Says you're a runaway bride who owes him compensation. Clara's blood went cold. That's a lie. He stole from me. Don't matter what's true, ma'am. Matters what he can prove. And he's got papers. Got witnesses back east willing to swear you promised to marry him. Witnesses he paid. Most likely. Leo shook his head. The boss told him to go to hell. Said any court that tries to take you off this ranch will have to come through him first. Clara sank into a chair. Her hands were shaking. He shouldn't do that. He shouldn't put himself at risk for me. Miss Clara. Leo crouched down beside her, his eyes earnest. The boss hasn't stood up for nothing in 8 years, not since his wife and daughter died. The fact that he's willing to fight for you, that means something. It meant everything, and it terrified her. That night Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow cot in the storage room staring at the ceiling, her mother's skillet clutched against her chest. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the darkness she could hear the men taking shifts on watch. Because of her. All of this because of her. She should leave. The thought came unbidden, cold, and logical. If she left, Silas would follow her. He'd leave the ranch alone. Leave Nathaniel alone. All of this chaos and danger, it would disappear with her. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't do it. Not because she was selfish. Not because she was scared. Because leaving would mean letting Silas win. And Clara Jane Whitmore had decided somewhere between the frozen gates and the warm cookhouse that she was done letting men like Silas Crenshaw decide her fate. The attack came 5 days later. Clara was preparing the noon meal when she heard a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind. Not the normal sounds of ranch work. This was different. Urgent. Wrong. Shouting. Men's voices raised in alarm, and then the scream of a horse in terror. She ran to the window. The corral was chaos. Horses were rearing and plunging, crashing against the fence rails, their eyes rolling white with fear. In the middle of it all, she could see men running, trying to control the animals, Then she saw what had caused it. Someone had cut the fence. Not just cut it, destroyed it. The entire eastern section of the corral was down, the posts splintered, the wire tangled on the ground. And through the gap, a dozen wild mustangs were surging in, driving the ranch horses into a frenzy. Sabotage. This was sabotage. Clara grabbed her skillet and ran. She didn't think about the danger, didn't think about her own safety. All she knew was that the ranch was under attack, and she wasn't going to stand by and watch. The yard was pandemonium. Men were everywhere, trying to separate the wild horses from the ranch stock, trying to herd them in different directions, shouting orders that got lost in the cacophony. A Palomino mare had gotten loose and was galloping straight toward the main house. And in the middle of it all, she saw Nathaniel. He was on foot, trying to calm his prize stallion, a massive black horse that was rearing and striking out with its hooves. The animal was terrified beyond reason, and Nathaniel was directly in the path of those iron-shod feet. Nathaniel! Clara's scream was swallowed by the noise. She ran toward him, her skillet clutched like a weapon, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the stallion rear, saw Nathaniel try to dodge, saw the hoof come down. It caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, sending him crashing to the frozen ground. He didn't get up. Clara didn't remember crossing the last 20 feet. One moment she was running, the next, she was on her knees beside him, her hands on his face, his blood on her fingers. "Nathaniel! Nathaniel, can you hear me?" His eyes were open, but unfocused. Blood was spreading across his shirt from a wound she couldn't see. His breathing was shallow, ragged. "Get help!" she screamed. "Someone get help!" Zeke appeared out of nowhere. He took one look at Nathaniel, then sprinted toward the bunkhouse. Clara pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The blood was warm, so warm against the cold air, and it kept coming, soaking through her fingers, staining the frozen ground beneath them. "Stay with me," she begged. "Nathaniel, please, stay with me." His eyes found hers. For a moment, the fog seemed to clear. "Clara." Her name was barely a whisper. "I'm here. I'm right here. Don't you dare give up on me." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Bossy." "You bet I am." Tears were streaming down her cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "And I'm going to keep being bossy until you're back on your feet. So don't you even think about dying." "Wouldn't dream of it." His eyes closed. "Nathaniel, Nathaniel." Jebediah was there, and Leo and Hans were pulling her back away from him. She fought them, screaming, but they were too strong. "Let us work, Miss Clara. We got to get him inside." They carried him to the main house. Clara followed, her hands red with his blood, her mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. Silas did this. Silas cut that fence. She knew it with a certainty that went beyond evidence. This was exactly the kind of cowardly, indirect attack he would choose. He'd never face an enemy head-on. He'd always strike from the shadows, always make someone else pay the price. But this time, he'd gone too far. The next hours were the longest of Clara's life. There was no doctor for miles. The nearest one was in Providence Crossing, and the storm had gotten worse. No one could make the journey safely. So they did what they could with what they had. Clara cleaned the wound, a deep gash from the stallion's hoof, running from shoulder to chest. She stitched it closed with thread and needle, her hands steady, despite the terror screaming in her heart. Her mother had taught her to sew fabric. Flesh wasn't so different. She made poultices from the herbs Zeke had gathered. She kept the fire burning hot and the room warm. She sat beside Nathaniel's bed through the night, watching his chest rise and fall, willing him to keep breathing. Augusta appeared at midnight. She stood in the doorway of her nephew's bedroom, her face pale, her hands trembling on her cane. For once, there was no cruelty in her expression, just fear. "How is he?" Clara didn't look up from Nathaniel's face. "Alive, for now. The doctor can't come. Storm's too bad." Augusta took a step into the room, then another. She moved to the opposite side of the bed and looked down at her nephew, this man she'd helped raise, this man she'd controlled and manipulated for 8 years. "I've been cruel to you," she said quietly. Clara said nothing. "I told myself I was protecting him, protecting Elizabeth's memory. But the truth is," Augusta's voice cracked, "the truth is, I was punishing him for surviving when she didn't." Still, Clara didn't speak. "He blames himself, you know, for the fever that took them. He'd been away on business when it started. By the time he got back, Elizabeth was already gone. Little Sarah, my great-niece, she held on for 3 more days. He sat by her bed the whole time, watching her fade away." Augusta's hand reached out, trembling, to touch Nathaniel's face. "He told me once that Sarah's last words were, 'Daddy, I'm cold.' And nothing he did could make her warm." A tear tracked down the old woman's weathered cheek. "He's been trying to stay cold ever since, because if he lets himself feel, he has to feel that." Clara finally looked up. "Why are you telling me this?" Augusta met her eyes. "Because I was wrong about you. I thought you were trying to take Elizabeth's place, but that's not it, is it? You're not trying to replace anyone. You're just warm." She looked back at Nathaniel. He needs that. I was too broken to give it to him. Too angry. Too lost in my own grief. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But you're not broken, Miss Whitmore. Not yet. Don't let this world break you. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know if I can save him. Then just stay with him. Augusta reached across the bed and for the first time touched Clara's hand. Don't let him be cold when he wakes up. If he wakes up. Neither of them said it. Neither of them needed to. Augusta left. Clara stayed. The night stretched on endless and dark. Clara held Nathaniel's hand and talked to him about nothing, about everything. About her mother and the spice pouch. About Boston and the dreams she'd had before Silas destroyed them. About walking through the blizzard and seeing the ranch gates and knowing somehow that this was where she was supposed to be. You saved me, she whispered. That first day. You could have turned me away. You should have turned me away. But you didn't. His hand was limp in hers. His face was pale waxy in the lamplight. So you don't get to die. You hear me. You don't get to save my life and then just leave. That ain't fair. That ain't... Her voice broke. She pressed his hand against her cheek, feeling the rough calluses against her skin. Please, she breathed. Please, come back. The hours crawled by. Clara dozed in her chair, jerking awake every few minutes to check his breathing, his pulse, the bandage on his chest. The fire burned low. The storm howled outside. And then, just before dawn, Nathaniel opened his eyes. Clara. She bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. I'm here. I'm right here. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no wall, no stone. Just a man stripped bare by pain and fever, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. You stayed. Of course I stayed. She was crying again. She didn't care. You think I'd let you die without telling you what a stubborn, pig-headed, impossible man you are? That ghost of a smile again. Bossy. You already said that. Bears repeating. She laughed a wet, broken sound that was half-sob. How do you feel? Like a horse stepped on me. That's because a horse did step on you. Ah. He tried to shift position and winced. That explains it. Clara's hands were on his face, his chest checking his temperature, checking his wound. You scared me half to death. Don't ever do that again. I'll try. His hand came up slowly, painfully, and covered hers. Clara. What? Thank you. For what? For not letting me be cold. She stared at him. He knew. Somehow through the fever and the pain he'd heard Augusta's words. He knew. I wouldn't know how, she said softly. Being warm is the only thing I'm good at. His fingers tightened on hers. That ain't true. You're good at a lot of things. A pause. The cooking's pretty fair too. She laughed again, and this time it was real, a bright, clear sound that seemed to push back against the darkness. Pretty fair, she repeated. I drag myself through a blizzard, nearly die, make you the best meals you've had in years, and all I get is pretty fair. Don't want you getting cocky. Too late. They sat there in the gray pre-dawn light, hands intertwined, and something passed between them. Not words, something deeper. An understanding. A promise. The door opened. Zeke stood there, his dark eyes taking in the scene. He looked at Nathaniel, then at Clara, and a slow smile spread across his face. He raised one hand and pressed it against his chest. Then he pointed at both of them. Thank you. Both of you. Clara understood. They all survived the night, not just Nathaniel, but all of them. The ranch. The family they'd become. The storm's breaking. Zeke signed his hands, moving in the language Clara had been learning in stolen moments. Riders coming from town. Clara's heart clenched. Silas. Zeke shook his head. He made a different sign, one she didn't recognize, then pointed toward the window. She went to look. The snow had stopped. The sky was clearing pale blue, showing through the gray. And on the road leading to the ranch, she could see riders. Not one or two, but a dozen, maybe more. And at their head she could make out a badge catching the early morning light. The law. Clara turned back to Nathaniel. "There's a posse coming." He was already trying to sit up, his face tight with pain. "Help me." "You shouldn't." "Help me, Clara. I need to face this standing." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was being a stubborn, pig-headed, impossible man. But she understood. Some things you had to face on your feet. She helped him dress, helped him walk to the front porch. Augusta was already there, her face grim, her hands tight on her cane. The ranch hands had gathered in the yard, forming a loose semicircle, a protective barrier. The riders stopped at the gate. The man at the head was old, with a silver mustache and weathered face. The star on his chest said, "Territorial Marshal." Behind him, bound and slumped in his saddle, was Silas Crenshaw. "Nathaniel Hollister," the marshal called out. "That's me. Name's Henry Cole. I'm here about a matter of horse theft and destruction of property." He jerked his head toward Silas. "Caught this one about 10 miles east. He was riding one of your Mustangs and had wire cutters in his saddlebag." Clara felt her legs go weak. "He also had this." The marshal held up a piece of paper. "A letter to his associates back east bragging about how he was going to destroy your ranch and take back his property." His eyes found Clara. That property being Miss Clara Whitmore. Silas's head came up. His face was bruised, his eyes desperate. "She belongs to me. We had an agreement." "Shut your mouth." The marshal's voice was flat. "I've seen your agreement. I've also seen the sworn statements from witnesses in Boston saying you forged most of it." He looked at Nathaniel. "This man has outstanding warrants in 3 territories. He's a swindler, a thief, and now a saboteur. Whatever claim he had on Miss Whitmore died the minute he cut your fence." Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only stand there watching justice unfold like something from a dream. The marshal tipped his hat. "We'll be taking him to stand trial. My apologies for the trouble he's caused." "Marshal." Nathaniel's voice was steady, despite the pain he must be feeling. "Thank you. Just doing my job." Cole gathered his reins. "Miss Whitmore, you're free to go wherever you please. No one has any legal claim on you." Free. The word echoed in Clara's mind as the posse rode away, taking Silas with them. She was free, truly free. For the first time in months, no one was hunting her. No one was threatening her. No one had any power over her at all. She turned to Nathaniel. He was leaning heavily against the porch railing, his face pale, but his eyes were bright. "Looks like you're stuck with me," she said. "Looks like." He reached out and took her hand. Right there in front of Augusta and the ranch hands and God and everyone. "I can think of worse fates." Augusta made a sound that might have been a laugh. "For heaven's sake, Nathaniel, just tell the girl you want her to stay." "I want you to stay," he said, his gray eyes fixed on Clara's face. "Not as my cook, not as an employee, as—" He hesitated, searching for words. "As whatever you want to be." Clara looked at him, this cold, hard man who had shown her warmth when no one else would, this broken man who had started to heal. "How about we start with partner," she said, "and see where it goes from there." His hand tightened on hers. "I can work with that." From somewhere in the gathered crowd, Jebediah let out a whoop. The other men started cheering, slapping each other on the back, their faces split with grins. Augusta shook her head, but she was smiling, actually smiling. "I suppose this means I'll have to be civil." "It means," Clara said, "that we're all going to figure out how to be a family, together." The old woman's eyes glistened. "I suppose I can try." Zeke appeared at Clara's side. He touched her shoulder, then signed something she didn't quite catch. "What did he say?" she asked Leo. Leo was grinning. "He said the kitchen needs a new sign. Something with your name on it." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "Tell him I'd like that." She looked out at the snow-covered ranch, at the broken corral that would need mending, at the main house that would need healing, at the people who had become her family. She'd come here with nothing but a skillet and a spice pouch. She'd found something worth more than gold. The weeks after Silas's arrest passed like a fever breaking. Nathaniel healed slowly, his body mending in the way of men who'd spent their lives working the land, stubborn and steady. Clara changed his bandages every morning, checking for infection, monitoring the wound that ran from shoulder to chest like a jagged river. He never complained, not once. But she caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. Those gray eyes that had once been cold as winter steel now held something warmer, something that made her heart do strange things in her chest. She pretended not to notice. There would be time for that later. Right now, there was a ranch to rebuild. The corral fence went up first. Every able-bodied man on the ranch pitched in, even Jebediah with his bad knee, and Leo with his tendency to hammer his own thumb. Clara brought them coffee and biscuits, and they worked through the cold until the fence stood strong again. Better than before, Tom Barker declared, running his hand along the new posts. Silas did us a favor in a way, gave us a reason to fix what was already weak. Clara thought about that, about how destruction sometimes cleared the way for something stronger. She thought about herself too, about the woman she'd been when she stumbled through those gates, frozen, desperate, convinced she was worthless. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another life. The new Clara had calluses on her hands and flour in her hair. She had a family who called her by name. She had a purpose. She had a home. Augusta surprised everyone. The old woman who had spent weeks trying to drive Clara away now became her unlikely ally. It started small, a nod of approval when Clara served a particularly good roast, a grudging compliment on her biscuits. Then it grew into something more. One morning, Augusta appeared in the cookhouse doorway with a wooden box in her hands. Clara looked up from her bread dough. "Ma'am, I've been going through some old things." Augusta's voice was gruff, almost embarrassed. "Found these in a trunk. They belong to Elizabeth." She set the box on the table and opened it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a collection of cooking implements. A silver ladle, a set of measuring spoons, a worn wooden rolling pin with flowers carved into the handles. Clara's breath caught. "I can't." "You can and you will." Augusta's dark eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "Elizabeth would have wanted them used. She was like you, you know. Believed that food was love. Believed that a kitchen was the heart of a home." Clara touched the rolling pin with trembling fingers. The wood was smooth and warm, worn down by years of use. "She sounds like my mother," Clara said softly. "Maybe that's why Nathaniel saw something in you." Augusta cleared her throat. "The first day you arrived, when you made that stew, he came to me afterward. First time he'd sought me out in years. You know what he said?" Clara shook her head. "He said the cookhouse smells like home again." Augusta's voice cracked. 8 years, and that was the first time he'd used that word. Home. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me that." Augusta nodded once her usual sharp manner softened. "Use the tools well, Miss Whitmore. That's all the thanks I need." She turned and walked out, her cane tapping against the floor, leaving Clara alone with the weight of legacy in her hands. That night, Clara made apple pie with Elizabeth's rolling pin. She hadn't planned it. But as she was preparing the evening meal, her hand reached for the carved wooden handle without thinking. The moment she touched it, something shifted inside her. She wasn't replacing Elizabeth. She understood that now. She was continuing something, a tradition of warmth and care that had been interrupted but never truly ended. The dough rolled out smooth and perfect under the floured pin. Clara pressed it into the pan, filled it with sliced apples and cinnamon and sugar, and wove a lattice top with strips of pastry. When she pulled it from the oven, the smell filled the cookhouse like a blessing. The men ate in reverent silence, as they always did with her best dishes. But it was Nathaniel's reaction that mattered. He took a bite of pie, stopped, looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Where did you get that rolling pin?" Clara's heart stuttered. "Augusta gave it to me. It was Elizabeth's. I'm sorry, I should have asked." "No." He shook his head. "No, don't apologize." He set down his fork and stood up, his movements slow and careful. He walked around the table until he was standing in front of her. "My wife used to make this pie," he said quietly. "Every Sunday. She said the secret was in the rolling. You had to use a light hand, let the dough breathe." Clara nodded. "My mother said the same thing." "I haven't tasted anything like it in 8 years." His gray eyes searched her face. "Until tonight." Clara didn't know what to say. Didn't know if there was anything to say. Nathaniel reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers strong and sure. "I've been cold for a long time, Clara. Told myself I deserved to be. That letting myself feel anything would be a betrayal." His voice dropped lower. "But you walked through that blizzard with nothing but a skillet, and you've been thawing me out ever since. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You already have," Clara whispered. "You gave me a home. I gave you a job, a room." He shook his head. "That ain't the same as a home." "It is to me." They stood there in the warm, fragrant cookhouse, surrounded by the remains of supper and the sounds of men pretending not to watch. Clara could feel her heart beating in her throat. "I ain't good with words," Nathaniel said finally. "Never have been, but I want you to know something." "What?" "That first day when you said you weren't worth much, I knew you were lying. I could see it in your eyes. Could see you were worth more than you believed." Clara felt tears threatening again. "Nathaniel, let me finish." His hand tightened on hers. "I've watched you for weeks now. Watched you work until your hands bled. Watched you stand up to my aunt. Watched you face down that Snake Crenshaw without flinching. And I've realized something." "What?" "You ain't just worth something, Clara Jane Whitmore. You're worth everything." The tears came, then streaming down her face. She didn't try to hide them. "That might be the most words you've ever said at once," she managed. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Don't get used to it." "I wouldn't dream of it." He pulled her closer slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His arms wrapped around her strong and steady, and Clara pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. It was strong, alive, warm. "Partners," he said against her hair. "That's what you said you wanted. It's a good start. And if I wanted more, eventually..." Clara pulled back just enough to look at his face. Those gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were soft, uncertain, hopeful, the eyes of a man who'd forgotten how to want something and was just beginning to remember. "Then you'd better learn to use more words," she said. He laughed, actually laughed, a rusty, unpracticed sound that was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. "Deal," he said. Zeke made the sign that spring. The winter had been long and hard, but it had also been full. Full of meals shared around crowded tables. Full of laughter that echoed off the cookhouse walls. Full of small moments that added up to something bigger than Clara had ever dared to hope for. When the snow finally melted and the first green shoots appeared on the hills, Zeke showed up at the cookhouse with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Clara was kneading bread, her hands covered in flour. "What's this?" Zeke unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a sign carved from dark wood, the letters burned deep and clear. Clara's Kitchen. Not Cookhouse. Not Hollister Ranch Kitchen. Clara's. She stared at it, her floury hands frozen in mid-knead. Zeke. He signed something, his hands moving quickly. Leo, who had been helping with the morning chores, translated. He says you gave this place a name the day you walked through those gates. He's just making it official. Clara touched the carved letters. They were smooth and perfect, crafted with the same patient skill Zeke brought to everything he did. Above the door, she asked. Zeke nodded, his dark eyes bright with satisfaction. They hung it together. Clara holding one end, Zeke holding the other, Leo directing from below. When it was level and secure, Clara stepped back to look at it. Her name. On a building. On a place that was hers. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Zeke touched his heart, then pointed at her. You don't have to say anything. This is what family does. Clara hugged him. He stiffened. At first he wasn't used to physical affection, but then his arms came up, and he hugged her back, fierce and tight. Thank you, she said. For everything. The herbs, the help, being my friend when I didn't have anyone. He pulled back and signed something she didn't catch. What did he say? She asked Leo. Leo grinned. He said you were his friend first. He was just waiting for you to notice. Clara laughed, wiping her eyes with her floury hands. Tell him I notice now. Zeke smiled, that rare bright smile that transformed his whole face, and nodded once. The celebration came a week later. It wasn't planned. It just happened the way good things sometimes do. The weather was warm, the work was done, and someone, probably Jebediah, suggested they ought to mark the occasion. What occasion? The occasion of surviving. Of rebuilding. Of becoming something more than a collection of hired hands and a lonely rancher. Clara cooked for 3 days straight. She made roast beef and mashed potatoes. She made biscuits and gravy. She made apple pie and peach cobbler. She made a massive pot of the stew that had saved her life, the one with her mother's spices, the one that smelled like love. Augusta contributed her shepherd's stew recipe, the one with the bruised thyme. Clara made it exactly as the old woman had described, and when Augusta tasted it, her eyes filled with tears. Just like Mama used to make, she whispered. That's the highest compliment I've ever received, Clara said. Augusta reached out and squeezed her hand. You've earned it, child. The whole ranch gathered in the cookhouse that evening. Every hand, every worker. Everyone who called Hollister Ranch home. They crammed around the long tables, shoulder to shoulder, passing plates and sharing stories. Clara sat at the head of one table, Nathaniel at the other. They kept catching each other's eyes across the crowded room, sharing secret smiles. Speech, someone called out. Boss, give us a speech. Nathaniel stood up slowly. His wound had healed well, but he still moved with care. His gray eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces of the men who'd worked beside him for years. I ain't good at speeches, he said. Most of you know that. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But I want to say something. Couple months ago, a woman walked through a blizzard to get here. She had nothing but a skillet and a pouch full of spices. She was half frozen and starving and desperate. He paused, his eyes finding Clara's. I almost turned her away. Almost told her we didn't need a cook. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she held onto that skillet like it was all she had in the world. Maybe it was just dumb luck. His voice softened. Whatever it was, I'm glad I listened to it. Because that woman, Clara Jane Whitmore, she didn't just cook for us. She saved us. She saved this ranch. She saved... He stopped. Swallowed hard. She saved me. The room went quiet. Even Jebediah, who always had something smart to say, was silent. Nathaniel raised his cup. To Clara, he said. The heart of Hollister Ranch. To Clara. The response came from every throat in the room, cups raised high. Clara stood up, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. I don't deserve... Yes, you do. Augusta interrupted. For once in your life, girl, just accept the compliment. Laughter broke the tension. Clara laughed too, wiping her eyes. All right, she said. All right, but I want to say something too. The room quieted again. When I walked through those gates, I thought I was looking for a job, a place to survive. I never expected... She had to stop, her voice breaking. I never expected to find a family. She looked around the room at Leo with his eager young face, at Jebediah with his weathered smile, at Zeke standing quiet in the corner, at Augusta, sitting ramrod straight, but with tears on her cheeks. At Nathaniel, watching her with those gray eyes that had finally learned to be warm. My mama used to say that food is more than fuel. She said it's memory. It's love. She said, with the right spices, you can make a stranger feel like he's home. Clara's voice strengthened. I never understood what she meant. Not really. Not until I came here. She raised her own cup. To family, she said. The one we're born with and the one we choose. To family. The celebration lasted until the stars came out. Eventually the men drifted back to the bunkhouse bellies, full hearts light. Augusta retired to the main house, but not before squeezing Clara's hand one more time. You did good, child, she said. Elizabeth would have liked you. Thank you, ma'am. That means everything. Zeke was the last to leave besides Nathaniel. He paused at the cookhouse door and signed something. What did he say? Clara asked. Nathaniel's voice came from behind her. He said the sign looks good above the door. Said it belongs there. Clara turned. Nathaniel was standing in the middle of the cookhouse, the lamplight casting warm shadows across his face. He looked, peaceful. More peaceful than she'd ever seen him. Walk with me, he asked. They walked through the quiet ranch yard, past the new corral fence, past the barn where the horses were settling for the night. The sky above was a vast expanse of stars, more than Clara had ever seen in Boston. They stopped at the gate, the same iron gate where Clara had collapsed in the snow all those weeks ago. This is where I first saw you, Nathaniel said. Frozen half to death, clutching that skillet like your life depended on it. My life did depend on it. That skillet and those spices, they were all I had. And now, Clara thought about the question. Really thought about it. Now I have more than I ever imagined. A place to live, work I love, people who care about me. She turned to face him. A partner. Just a partner. Her heart skipped. What else would you call it? Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the faint scar on his chin, the way his mouth curved when he was trying not to smile. I'm still learning to use more words, he said, but I've been thinking about some. Such as, I was dead before you came here, walking around running a ranch, going through the motions, but dead inside. You brought me back to life. Clara's breath caught. Nathaniel, let me finish. I ain't good at this, and I might not get the courage again. He took her hands in his. I spent 8 years punishing myself, telling myself I didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve love, didn't deserve anything but cold, and lonely, and empty. His thumbs traced circles on her palms. Then you showed up with your skillet and your spices and your stubborn refusal to give up. And you showed me that cold ain't the same as strong, that shutting people out ain't the same as protecting yourself, that it's possible to honor the dead without joining them. He lifted one hand to her face, cupping her cheek. I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I'm stubborn and moody, and I'll probably forget to use my words more often than not. But I can promise I'll try, every day, for as long as you'll let me. Clara leaned into his touch. That sounds like a proposal. I suppose it does. His voice was barely a whisper. Is that a problem? Only if you expect an answer right now. I'll wait. He smiled a real smile, one that reached his eyes. I've gotten good at waiting. Clara reached up and covered his hand with hers. "You won't have to wait long," she said. She kissed him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't passionate. It was soft and gentle and full of promise, the first warmth of spring after a long, hard winter. When they finally pulled apart, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners," she agreed. "And maybe eventually something more." "I can work with that." They stood there at the gate, wrapped in each other's arms, while the stars wheeled overhead, and the wind carried the smell of warm bread from Clara's kitchen across the quiet ranch. She had come here with nothing. She had found everything. And for the first time in her life, Clara Jane Whitmore knew exactly where she belonged. Not because of the sign above the cookhouse door, not because of the partnership papers Nathaniel would eventually file with the territorial office, not because of the ring that would one day rest on her finger. Because home wasn't a place. Home was the people who made you feel warm when the world outside was cold. Home was choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Home was the smell of bread baking and coffee brewing and family gathering around a table. Home was here. Home was now. Home was forever. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from in the world. We love seeing how far these tales travel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and if you'd really like to support us, please hit that like button to help this story reach more hearts. Until next time, may your kitchens be warm and your tables full.